Okay, we're going to do Unit 4, and this covers Chapters 22, Respiratory System, and Chapter 23, Digestive System. There's a lot of information in this, and in order to keep these videos at a reasonable length, I'll try to get through this data in time. The respiratory system contains the upper and lower respiratory tracts. The upper respiratory tract contains the respiratory organs located outside the chest cavity: the nose, nasal cavities, pharynx, larynx, and upper trachea. The lower respiratory tract consists of organs located in the chest cavity: the lower trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. The lower part of the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli, can't talk this morning, are located in the lungs. The pleural membranes and the muscles that form the chest cavity are also part of the lower respiratory tract. The nose includes an external portion that forms part of the face and an internal portion called the nasal cavities. The nasal cavities are separated by the right and left halves by a partition called the nasal septum. And you will sometimes hear when patients have a septal deviation, they may have trouble with sleep apnea and that sort of thing, and they may have a deviated septum. And you can read more about that in your textbook. Please also read about the pharynx and the larynx, which is also called the voice box. We've talked earlier about the alveoli. Remember, they're tiny air sacs at the very end of the bronchioles inside the lung that form at the very distal ends of the respiratory passages. They're very important. Oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the bloodstream there. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. Oxygen diffuses out, carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. Atelectasis is a condition that you will see that means the alveoli have collapsed, and atelectasis is a life-threatening condition because their lungs are that part of their lung and the alveoli are collapsing. The two lungs are located in the pleural cavities. The outside of each lung and the inner chest wall are lined with a continuous serous membrane called the pleura. The pleura are named according to their location. The membrane on the outer surface of each lung is called the visceral pleura, and the membrane lining within the chest wall is called the parietal pleura. These two membranes are attracted to each other like two flat pieces of glass that are moist. The plates of the glass can slide past one another but offer some resistance when you try to pull them apart, and that's the way these pleura interact with one another. Air moves through the following structures from the nasal cavities to the pharynx, to the larynx, to the trachea, to the bronchi, to the bronchioles, and finally to the alveoli. And that is where the exchange of gases occur. So that's an important anatomical information you need to understand, how air moves down all the way into our lungs. The largest of the structures in the respiratory system is in the larynx is the thyroid cartilage. It's a tough cartilage that protrudes in the front of the neck. The thyroid cartilage is larger in men and is often called the Adam's apple. The epiglottis is another cartilage structure located at the top of the larynx. The epiglottis acts as a flap and very important. It covers the opening of the trachea during swallowing so that food does not enter the lungs. When you swallow food, the epiglottis covers the glottis, preventing food from entering the lower respiratory passage. Instead, the food enters the esophagus and empties then into the stomach. So the flap is very important because it closes and that keeps the food from entering into our lungs. The trachea or windpipe is a tube 4 to 5 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. The trachea extends from the larynx downward into the thoracic cavity, where it splits into the right and left bronchi. The trachea lies in front of the esophagus, which is the food tube. C-shaped rings of cartilage partially surround the trachea for its entire length and serve to keep it open, kind of like a stent in the heart. It keeps the trachea open. Without this strong cartilaginous support, the trachea would collapse and shut off flow of air through the respiratory passages. And there is a short discussion on tracheostomies, tracheostomy tubes in your textbook, and you will learn more about that when you're in your labs. You will learn how to manage the care of a patient who has a tracheostomy, how to change the dressing, and how to suction the patient through the trach. Most of us equate breathing with respiration. Respiration includes breathing, but it is more than breathing. It involves the entire process of gas exchange between the atmosphere and the body's cells. Respiration includes 3 steps: ventilation, or breathing, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide by the blood. So it's more than just breathing. It's especially important because of the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Boyle's law is the relationship between pressure and volume. So you need to read that. There are some examples in the chapter with inner tubes, and kind of helps you understand pressure and volume. The smaller the volume, the higher the pressure. The greater the volume, the lower the pressure. So the bigger the tire is, the greater the volume, the bigger the tire is, the lower the pressure is in the tire. Got it backwards. The smaller the volume, the higher the pressure. The greater the volume, the lower the pressure. If volume changes, then pressure changes. So when you inhale in, you breathe in, air flows into the lungs. The rib cage moves up and out on inhalation and increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So our thoracic cavity is enlarged when we breathe in. As the volume in the lung increases, so as it expands, the pressure in the lung decreases. So air flows from higher pressure to lower pressure through the nose into the lungs. So that's how we get air in, because it's higher pressure outside in the atmosphere. And when we've expanded our lung, higher pressure to lower pressure. So that's how we get the air in. That's Boyle's law. On exhalation, so when we breathe out, the thoracic and lung volume decreases. So it goes in. The decreased lung volume causes the pressure within the lungs to increase, so we have more pressure inside, and the air flows out of our lungs, and that is Boyle's law. The diaphragm is the chief muscle of inhalation. It is a dome-shaped muscle that forms the floor of the abdominal cavity. The motor nerves supplying the respiratory muscles are the phrenic and the intercostal nerves. The phrenic nerve exits from the spinal cord and is distributed to the diaphragm. Firing of the phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm to contract. The intercostal nerves supply the intercostal muscles. Thus, inhalation is initiated by the firing of the phrenic and the intercostal nerves. Those are the 2 nerves. We've talked about each nerve has a pathway and causes something else to happen. So these are the phrenic and the intercostal nerves. You need to review figure 22.9 for the steps in ventilation. 98% of all oxygen within our body is transported by the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So you need to remember, oxygen is transported through the red blood cells. The remaining 2% of oxygen is dissolved in plasma. As soon as oxygen enters the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, it immediately forms a loose bond with the iron portion of the hemoglobin molecule. This new molecule is oxyhemoglobin, and we talked about that in an earlier unit. As the oxygenated blood travels to the cells throughout the body, the oxygen unloads from the hemoglobin module and diffuses across the capillary walls into the cells. So it attaches and becomes oxyhemoglobin, travels into the capillaries, and then it diffuses across the capillary walls into the cells. The oxygen is eventually used up by the metabolizing cells. Carbon dioxide, blood carries carbon dioxide from the metabolizing cells to the lungs, where it is exhaled. So we can't have a lot of carbon dioxide or we'll quit breathing. Blood carries carbon dioxide in the following three forms. 10% is dissolved in plasma, 20% combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, and 70% is converted to the bicarbonate ion HCO3. Please note that blood carries most of the carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate. So 70% of it is carried in the blood as bicarbonate. How does the body control breathing? By nervous and chemical mechanisms. The nervous mechanism involves several areas of the brain, most importantly the brain stem. The main control center for breathing in the medulla oblongata is called the medullary respiratory control center. So the main organ for breathing is in the brain stem in the medulla oblongata. It sets the basic breathing rhythm, and that's shown in figure 22.12. And so what you will see is patients who have brain injuries then most often have respiratory issues. They'll either be on a ventilator, or if they're not, they're on a BiPAP, they're on something, because that brain stem is many times injured, and it causes respiratory breathing problems. Chemicals dissolved in the blood also affect breathing, including, as I said before, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and you remember hydrogen controls the pH. So what is that? The acidity and the alkaline, and oxygen. These chemicals are detected by chemosensitive cells called chemoreceptors. When activated, these chemoreceptors stimulate the areas of the brainstem concerned with respiration. The central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata detect change in the blood concentrations of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. If carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion concentrations increase, so as I said before, if we can't have a lot of carbon dioxide in our body, the central chemoreceptors signal the respiratory center to increase its activity. So if it's raising, then it tells the brain to start breathing faster and blow that carbon dioxide off, so that we can decrease carbon dioxide. And then the opposite is true. If the chemoreceptors sense that we're breathing too fast and we need to slow that down, it will tell us. So some common respiratory terms that we could talk about quickly are on page 425. Apnea means a temporary cease in breathing. So you will have patients who maybe are at the end of their life and they become what we call apneic. So apnea is a temporary cease of breathing. Chain stoking is an irregular breathing characterized by a series of shallow breaths and then gradually increases in the depth and rate, and then the series is followed by breaths that gradually decrease, and then it cycles. So they have shallow breaths, and then they start breathing real fast, and then it starts slowing down, and then they breathe real fast, and then it starts slowing down, and that's chain stoking, and you will see that happen. Cyanosis, I think we mentioned before, is the bluish color of the skin caused by low concentration of oxygen in the blood. Dyspnea is a difficulty or labored breathing. So if they're dyspneic, your patient is having labored breathing. Hypercapnia is an abnormally high concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. That's called hypercapnia. Hypocapnia is low concentration of carbon dioxide. Hypoxemia is low concentration of oxygen in the blood. Hypoxia is low concentration of oxygen in the tissues. So hypoxemia and hypoxia. Kussmaul breathing is when you see a patient who's in metabolic acidosis, they will be doing what we call Kussmaul breathing, and that's an increase in the rate and depth of respiration. So they're breathing real fast and real deep. They're in metabolic acidosis normally. Orthopnea is difficulty in breathing that is relieved by a sitting position. So if you have a patient who has COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD, or asthma, you will see your patients sitting up. They will many times put their hands over their, or that's what you need to have them do, put their hands over their bedside table and sit up and kind of lean over a little bit, or put pillows up so that you're raising that chest up and those arms up. And you will see people doing that automatically. So that's called orthopnea, and that's difficulty in breathing, but it's relieved by sitting up and doing those maneuvers. Rales, you'll hear about rales. Those are crackles. When you listen to the breath sounds, they're small clicking sounds in the lungs that resemble, if you take your hair and rub it right in your ear, that sound you hear is what you're going to hear in the lung. That's a rale. Rhonchi, you'll hear when you auscultate, and that is a snoring like sound that generally occurs when there's obstruction of a large airway, and it definitely sounds different than rales. We'll say patient has rales or rhonchi, or neither. Stridor is a high-pitched wheeze. You'll hear that oftentimes in babies who are having bronchial problems, and it can be heard on inhalation and exhalation, and it's caused by an obstruction of airflow in the upper airway. Not just babies. If you have a patient in severe respiratory distress, or if they're choking on something, you'll hear stridor, that real high-pitched wheeze. Tachypnea, that's rapid breathing. Wheezes we've talked about. Okay, moving on to the digestive system. The digestive tract and the accessory organs of digestion make up this thing we call the digestive system. Digestion is the process by which food is broken down into smaller particles suitable for absorption. Absorption is the process whereby the end products of digestion move across the walls of the digestive tract into the blood and lymph for distribution throughout the body. The digestive system has four functions: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and elimination. Just a brief thing about teeth, because teeth are part of this digestive. Teeth have three structures: the enamel, the dentin, and the cementum. And the deciduous teeth are often called the baby teeth. And babies start getting their teeth about 6 months of age. The tooth has three parts: the crown, the neck, and the root. Salivary glands. There are three pairs of salivary glands that secrete their contents into the mouth: the parotid glands, the submandibular glands, and the sublingual glands. And they're usually all kind of right in here. The parotid glands are the largest of the three glands and lie below and anterior to the ears. They are the glands infected by the mumps virus. The salivary glands are exocrine glands that secrete saliva, a watery fluid that contains mucus and one digestive enzyme called salivary amylase. And it's amazing, but there's approximately 1 liter of saliva is secreted each day. So 1 liter is the size of a large IV bag. That's a liter of fluid. This is why it's important for you to monitor your patients, especially those who are in any kind of respiratory distress or are elderly and are secreting a lot of saliva, and they can't swallow it, they can't help themselves get it out of their mouth. Well, you must watch your patients very carefully and help them, and you may have to help them suction their mouth to get this fluid that is secreted daily out of their airways. The esophagus is the food tube that carries food from the pharynx to the stomach. Food is pushed from swallowing into the esophagus, and stimulation from peristaltic activity causes the food to move through and into the stomach. And peristalsis, occurs throughout our body and moves food all the way through our body. Reflux is prevented because the lower esophageal sphincter closes after the food is in the stomach. So we have a sphincter, and it closes once the food gets into the stomach, and that prevents that reflux. Now, a lot of people have GERD or reflux because that sphincter is has weakened, and so then that's another whole issue you have to deal with. The stomach is a pouch-like organ that lies in the upper left part of the abdominal cavity under the diaphragm. The stomach secretes gastric juice, which includes digestive enzymes, hydrochloric acid, and intrinsic factor. The stomach is responsible for the mechanical digestion of food, the mixing and the mashing together of the food. Chemical digestion is limited. Absorption of liquid is also limited in the stomach. The stomach secretes gastric hormones and regulates the rate at which the partially digested food is delivered to the small intestine. So it's not all delivered at the same time. This is the most important function of the stomach, regulating the rate at which food is sent into the small intestine. The stomach can stretch because of rugae. There are folds that are in the stomach, and that's what allows our stomachs to stretch. The parts of the stomach are the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. And moving to small intestine and large intestine, acidic chyme is ejected by the stomach into the small intestine. The small intestine is considerably longer than the large intestine. The small intestine is 20 feet long. The small intestine is made up of the duodenum, which means 12, and 12 is the number 12. The duodenum means 12, and it's the width of 12 fingers. If you put 12 fingers, which is about 10 inches, and so that's how big the duodenum is. The jejunum and the ileum. The ileum completes the process of absorption of digestive end products, the absorption of B12, and the absorption of bile salts. The wall of the small intestine forms circular folds with finger-like projections called villi. The large number of villi and microvilli increases the amount of digested food and water that can be absorbed, so that's what helps us absorb our food. The end products of fat digestion enter the lymphatic capillary and form a lymph called chyle. Chyle. The chyle empties directly into the lymphatic system and eventually into general circulation. The large intestine is made up of the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. The large intestine is responsible for absorption of water and electrolytes, the synthesis of certain vitamins, temporary storage site of waste, and for elimination of waste. The liver is a large reddish-brown organ located in the mid and right upper abdominal cavity and is the largest organ in the body. The word hepatic refers to the liver. The liver synthesizes bile salts and secretes bile. it is responsible for the synthesis of plasma proteins, stores many substances, fat-soluble vitamins, and vitamin B12, and plays a role in the detoxification of drugs and other harmful substances. So the liver is very, very important for the monitoring of harmful substances in our body and detoxification of drugs. The liver has a unique arrangement of blood vessels called the hepatic portal system. Remember, hepatic means liver. Bile is a greenish yellow secretion produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. The bile pigments, bilirubin and biliverdin, are formed from the hemoglobin of worn out red blood cells. The bile salts are the most abundant constituents of the bile. Only the bile salts have a digestive function. They play an important role in fat digestion and the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. So our gallbladder helps us to digest fats and bile salts and fat-soluble vitamins. With gallbladder disease, a gallstone sometimes becomes lodged in the common bile duct, blocks the flow of bile into the duodenum, and deprives the stool of brown pigments. Bile that backs up behind the stones causes jaundice and impairs hepatic function or liver function. So gallstones can be very serious. The presence of stones in the gallbladder often causes an inflammation called cholecystitis. The ducts that connect the liver, gallbladder, and duodenum are called the biliary tree. This network of ducts includes the hepatic bile ducts, cystic duct, and common bile ducts. The pancreas is an accessory organ of digestion located just below the stomach. The main pancreatic duct joins with the common bile duct. The pancreatic duct carries digestive enzymes from the pancreas to the duodenum. The pancreas secretes both endocrine and exocrine substances. The pancreatic enzymes are the most important of all digestive enzymes. Without the pancreas, it would be very hard to digest any of these enzymes. So people who have certainly pancreatic cancer or pancreatitis have an inability to digest all these enzymes. So we'll study a lot more about the pancreas and the importance it is into our body. So I think that's long enough for you, but please read and study the nutritional information that's there at the end of the chapter, as well as the medical terminology and the disorders. Thank you.